the late summer of 36 BCE, more than 100,000 Roman troops marched through the choking dust of the highlands of Media Atropatene, intent on wiping the Parthian Empire from the map. The supreme commander, Mark Antony, had assembled a war machine of unprecedented scale, drawing legions from across the Mediterranean to avenge the infamous slaughter of Marcus Licinius Crassus at Carrhae 17 years earlier. He possessed the numbers, the veteran heavy infantry, and the allied cavalry necessary to secure a total victory and cement his undisputed dominance over the Roman Republic. Instead, through a single arrogant command decision regarding his vital logistics, he doomed over 30,000 of his own men to starvation, exposure, and a relentless barrage of Parthian arrows. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we break down the disastrous tactical split that exposed the Roman siege train, the unforgiving geography of the Parthian frontier, and the bitter 300-mile fighting retreat that broke the back of Mark Antony's political power. The march into Media Atropatene was not born from a sudden border provocation, but from a deeply entrenched political necessity back in Rome. 17 years prior, in 53 BCE, the Parthian cavalry had annihilated the legions of Marcus Licinius Crassus at Carrhae. That disaster did more than leave thousands of Roman soldiers dead beneath the scorching Mesopotamian sun. It resulted in the capture of the sacred legionary eagles. This loss was a humiliating open wound on Roman honor that the Republic's political elite could not ignore. Julius Caesar had clearly recognized the political value of avenging this defeat, meticulously organizing a massive eastern invasion force until his assassination in 44 BCE halted the campaign before it even began. Now, a decade later, the pressure to execute Caesar's unfinished war fell squarely on the shoulders of Mark Antony. As a triumvir ruling the wealthy eastern provinces, Antony found himself locked in an increasingly volatile Cold War with his younger rival, Octavian, who was systematically consolidating his grip over Italy and the Senate. To secure absolute supremacy in Rome, Antony needed more than just administrative control of the eastern frontier. He required a military triumph of such staggering magnitude that Octavian's political allies would be permanently neutralized. Conquering the Parthian Empire, the only rival superpower known to the Republic, would definitively cement the supreme commander as the undisputed heir to Caesar's military legacy. Relying heavily on the immense financial resources of the Ptolemaic kingdom, provided by his alliance with Cleopatra, Antony began to construct an invasion force that dwarfed anything the Senate had authorized in recent memory. This was not merely a punitive expedition meant to secure the borders. It was a war of annihilation designed to fundamentally alter the balance of global power and flood the Roman treasury with Eastern spoils. Every strategic calculation Antony made was ultimately driven by this desperate need for political capital. He could not afford a cautious, grinding conflict of attrition that dragged on for years while Octavian undermined him at home. The triumvir needed a decisive, crushing victory to present to the Senate. To achieve this, Antony ordered the mass mobilization of veteran legions from across the Mediterranean, deliberately over-engineering his force to ensure that Parthian mobility could not threaten his core infantry. The core of the Roman war machine consisted of 60,000 veteran legionaries. These were not fresh recruits, but hardened survivors of the recent civil wars, representing the very pinnacle of Mediterranean heavy infantry. To protect their flanks and screen the marching columns, Antony deployed 10,000 elite Iberian and Celtic cavalry, battle-tested horsemen accustomed to operating alongside the legions. Furthermore, the supreme commander mobilized an additional 30,000 allied infantry, bringing the total fighting force to roughly 100,000 men. Yet, the true anchor of this expedition, and its ultimate liability, was the massive logistical apparatus trailing behind the infantry. The Romans dragged a sprawling siege train consisting of 300 heavily laden wagons. These carts carried dismantled siege towers, catapults, and a massive 80-foot battering ram, all essential for cracking the fortified cities of the east. The resulting logistical undertaking was massive, requiring immense stockpiles of grain, thousands of pack animals, and a sprawling, complex supply chain simply to keep the men fed. The resulting army was a mechanical juggernaut of Roman engineering and military discipline, organized specifically to avoid the tactical errors that had doomed Crassus on the open sands. In planning his route, Antony demonstrated that he had thoroughly studied the tactical failures of 53 BCE. Crassus had marched straight into the flat, arid plains of Mesopotamia, offering the highly mobile Parthian horse archers a perfect, unobstructed shooting gallery. On the open sand, the Roman squares had no geographical anchor, allowing the enemy to maintain distance and systematically dismantle the legions with composite bows. To avoid repeating this exact scenario, Antony chose a northern approach. He marched his immense army through the mountainous terrain of the Roman-aligned Kingdom of Armenia. The rugged topography of the Armenian highlands naturally restricted the mobility of Parthian cavalry and funneled any potential engagement into narrow valleys where the Roman heavy infantry could hold a solid defensive line. This strategic detour was made possible by an alliance with King Artavasdes II of Armenia. The Armenian monarch offered more than just secure passage through his territory. He provided a critical military asset. Artavasdes pledged a substantial force of native cataphracts, heavily armored shock cavalry that could theoretically stand toe-to-toe with the elite Parthian lancers. For the imperial government in Rome, this alliance appeared to solve the inherent weaknesses of a Western army operating in the east. With secure supply lines through friendly territory and a heavy cavalry screen provided by a regional ally, Antony had engineered a campaign that seemingly neutralized the tactical advantages of the Parthian Empire. However, a strategy that excels on a map often shatters against the physical realities of the terrain. The route through the Armenian highlands and into the enemy territory of Media Atropatene was defensively sound, but logistically punishing. Moving an army of 100,000 men is equivalent to relocating a major ancient city every single day. The logistical footprint was staggering, requiring hundreds of tons of grain and forage to sustain the men, the cavalry mounts, and the thousands of draft animals. In the narrow, undulating mountain passes, the Roman column stretched out for miles, a crawling serpent of bronze and iron. The primary bottleneck was the vital siege train. The 300 wagons, pulled by plodding teams of oxen, dictated the pace of the entire supreme war machine. The air grew noticeably thinner and colder in the highland passes, a stark environmental reminder that the heavy infantry juggernaut was operating far from its natural Mediterranean theater. The ultimate operational target was Phraaspa, the heavily fortified capital of the Parthian vassal state of Media Atropatene. Antony calculated that laying siege to this vital regional hub would force the Parthian king, Phraates IV, to deploy his main army to relieve the city. If Phraates committed to a pitched battle near the walls, the Roman legions could finally close the distance and annihilate the enemy host. But breaching Phraaspa required the heavy equipment currently dragging miles behind the vanguard. The entire operation became a race against the seasons. The Highland summer offered a narrow window for campaigning, and the agonizingly slow pace of the ox-drawn carts was steadily eating away at the timeline. The pressure of the closing campaign season drove the Supreme Commander to make a calculation that defied basic Roman military doctrine. The groaning of stressed wooden axles and the slow plodding steps of exhausted oxen echoed through the narrow valleys, a constant reminder of their sluggish pace. Unwilling to lose the strategic initiative or risk being caught by the harsh mountain winter, Mark Antony chose speed over security. He ordered the army to divide, taking the elite core of his veteran legions and the bulk of his swift cavalry. Antony pushed aggressively ahead toward the Parthian vassal capital of Phraaspa. Command of the vital siege train was handed to Field Commander Statianus, who was left behind with roughly 10,000 men, 2 full legions, to guard the slow-moving engines and follow in the vanguard's wake. Splitting a massive force deep in hostile territory without secure, rapid lines of communication is one of the most perilous risks a commander can take. By advancing rapidly, Antony immediately stretched the physical distance between his striking force and his logistical anchor, effectively blinding both segments of the army to the other's situation. A siege train of this magnitude is inherently defenseless and dictates the terms of any engagement. Carts pulled by heavily yoked oxen cannot maneuver, reposition, or retreat under sudden fire. If attacked, the defending infantry are completely tethered to the static wagons. They are forced to hold a rigid defensive line to protect the highly flammable wooden structures, entirely stripping away the aggressive, mobile cohort tactics that made the Roman heavy infantry so lethal. Statianus and his 10,000 legionaries were now isolated, anchoring a miles-long, highly vulnerable convoy in a landscape they did not control. Furthermore, the geography of Media Atropatene actively worked against the Roman attempt at a rapid secret advance. The undulating hills and elevated mountain passes provided perfect vantage points for highly mobile enemy scouts who had been meticulously tracking the Roman columns since they crossed the border. Every strategic movement, every logistical bottleneck, and, most critically, the expanding tactical gap between Antony's vanguard and Statianus's rear guard was observed and systematically relayed back to the Parthian command. Mark Antony had assumed his speed would force the enemy into a reactive posture. Instead, the Roman heavy infantry was no longer a unified, impenetrable juggernaut. It had been fractured into 2 separate targets by its own commander, and the trailing element was burdened by massive, immovable assets. Believing his gamble had paid off, Antony arrived at the walls of Phraaspa exactly as he intended, swiftly encircling the city and attempting to establish a perimeter. However, without his heavy engineering equipment, the elite legions were forced to halt helplessly before the towering stone fortifications, their hard-won speed suddenly rendered entirely useless. They could not breach the gates. They could only dig in and wait for the cumbersome siege train to eventually catch up. But while the Supreme Commander stared at the unbroken walls of Phraaspa, waiting for engines that would never arrive, the King of Parthia, Phraates IV, realized the Romans had just exposed their throat. Phraates IV did not intend to fight the heavily armored vanguard under Mark Antony. His scouts had swiftly identified the sluggish, vulnerable tail of the Roman serpent, the immense siege train commanded by Statianus. Leaving a token garrison at Phraaspa to occupy the Supreme Commander, the Parthian king directed the full weight of his mobile cavalry to bypass the Roman vanguard entirely. Utilizing their deep knowledge of the undulating terrain of Media Atropatene, the Parthian host maneuvered through the highland passes, effectively vanishing from Roman sightlines until they converged on the isolated baggage train. The element of surprise was total, heavily compounded by the tactical rigidity of the Roman column. Statianus commanded 2 full legions, roughly 10,000 men, but they were stretched thin over miles of uneven mountain roads, physically tethered to plodding oxen and massive dismantled timber engines. The assault did not begin with a traditional clash of infantry lines, but with a relentless, calculated barrage of arrows. Parthian horse archers, utilizing their powerful composite bows, poured missile fire down upon the Roman column from the elevated ridges. The legionaries instinctively attempted to form their defensive squares and lock their shields, but the rugged terrain and the sprawling footprint of the 300 wagons made it impossible to establish a cohesive, unified line. Once the Roman infantry was sufficiently pinned down, bled, and disorganized by the constant archery, the Parthian cataphracts, heavily armored shock cavalry wielding long lances, charged down the slopes. The tactical mismatch was absolute. Lacking their own mobile cavalry screen to intercept the riders, the Romans were essentially static targets. Forced to defend the highly flammable carts, the 10,000 legionaries were systematically dismantled, crushed between the immovable bulk of their own siege engines and the relentless driving impact of the Parthian heavy horse. The primary objective of the Parthian strike, however, was not simply inflicting casualties, it was the total eradication of Antony's strategic capability. As the Roman defense inevitably collapsed under the sheer weight of the cavalry charges, the Parthians systematically torched the massive siege train. The vital 80-foot battering ram, the complex disassembled siege towers, and hundreds of carts carrying essential grain and engineering tools were set ablaze. The sight of burning timber and dark smoke rising thickly from the valleys served as the grim marker of the expedition's ruin. Statianus, fighting desperately to maintain his broken command, was killed in the final stages of the destruction. By the time the engagement concluded, approximately 10,000 Roman soldiers lay dead in the highland dirt. The mechanical heart of the Eastern campaign had been completely obliterated in a single afternoon, without the supreme commander even being present on the field. This localized military disaster immediately triggered a devastating geopolitical shift. King Artavasdes II of Armenia, who had been marching with his contingent of native cavalry near the rearguard, witnessed the sudden and sheer scale of the Parthian ambush. Recognizing that the Roman strategic plan had just violently unraveled and that the siege engines were permanently lost, the Armenian monarch made a swift, pragmatic calculation of survival. He ordered his forces to withdraw, abandoning the Roman expedition entirely and retreating toward his own borders, taking his crucial heavy cavalry with him. This defection stripped Antony of his most vital allied asset. The Romans were now entirely devoid of an adequate cavalry screen, leaving their marching flanks permanently exposed to Parthian harassment for the remainder of the campaign. Word of the catastrophe finally reached the vanguard at Phraaspa. Mark Antony immediately ordered his elite legions to abandon their perimeter, reversing their march in a desperate bid to rescue the rear guard and secure the supply lines. However, the speed of the Parthian execution meant the battle was over long before reinforcements could arrive. When the supreme commander finally reached the site of the ambush, the enemy cavalry had already vanished back into the vastness of the highlands. Antony rushed back, but he found only scattered corpses and the smoldering ashes of his siege train. Now he was deep in hostile territory, facing a fortified city with no way to break the walls. The reality of the lost siege train forced Mark Antony into an immediate and desperate tactical improvisation. Standing before the imposing stone fortifications of Phraaspa, the supreme commander ordered his veteran legions to achieve through raw manual labor what his destroyed engines were meant to do. Stripped of their towering siege structures and the massive 80-foot battering ram, the Romans attempted to construct massive earthen ramps to scale the defenses. Thousands of heavily armored infantrymen were repurposed into laborers, forced to dig trenches and pile dirt under the constant, harassing fire of the city's defenders. The rhythmic thud of iron pickaxes striking the hard highland earth became the defining sound of a campaign rapidly losing its momentum. Despite their legendary engineering discipline, building a siege mound of that scale by hand was an agonizingly slow process that exposed the men to daily casualties. The Roman heavy infantry, designed to aggressively close the distance and crush enemy formations in open combat, was now pinned in place, bleeding out in minor skirmishes at the base of an unbroken wall. While the physical siege stagnated, a far more lethal threat began to dismantle the Roman war machine from the inside: the sheer logistics of starvation. An army of nearly 80,000 remaining men, along with their surviving cavalry mounts and draft animals, consumes tens of tons of grain and forage every single day. The destruction of the baggage train meant that the expedition was now entirely dependent on the immediate surrounding territory for survival. Recognizing this critical vulnerability, King Phraates IV ordered a ruthless scorched earth policy. The Parthian cavalry systematically burned the fields, poisoned local wells, and destroyed the granaries throughout the region, ensuring that any Roman foraging party would find nothing but blackened earth. To feed his starving beast of an army, Antony was forced to dispatch increasingly larger detachments ever further away from the safety of the main camp. These extended foraging columns played perfectly into the hands of the Parthian tactical doctrine. Phraates IV strictly avoided the decisive pitched battle that Antony so desperately needed to salvage his political capital. Instead, the Parthian horse archers utilized their superior mobility to isolate, encircle, and ambush the Roman supply details. When the legionaries formed their tight defensive squares to repel the cavalry, the Parthians simply maintained their distance and rained arrows down upon them, instantly retreating into the hills the moment Roman reinforcements arrived. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare and attrition. The legions were trapped in a paralyzing cycle. They could not breach the city without starving, and they could not gather food without being systematically bled in the open fields. As the weeks dragged on, the temperature in the highlands of Media Atropatene began to plummet, signaling the rapid close of the campaign season. Antony finally recognized the inescapable geometry of the trap he had walked into. The Parthian strategy was never to defeat the Roman heavy infantry in a direct clash of arms, but to let the barren geography, the lack of calories, and the freezing weather act as their executioners. Remaining at Phraaspa meant total annihilation by starvation and exposure. Yet turning back meant marching 300 miles through hostile territory without a secure supply line or an allied cavalry screen. With the first snows threatening to block the mountain passes, Antony gave the bitterest order a Roman commander could issue: retreat. The moment Mark Antony ordered the legions to pull back from the walls of Phraaspa, the entire nature of the campaign shifted from a war of conquest into a desperate 300-mile fighting retreat. The objective was no longer imperial glory, but reaching the safety of the Araxes River at the Armenian border before the army disintegrated entirely. This withdrawal would take 27 agonizing days of constant maneuver. It required navigating back through the same undulating, unforgiving highlands of Media Atropatene that had already cost them their siege train. Mark Antony was forced to reorganize his surviving forces, placing his most elite, battle-hardened veterans in the rearguard to absorb the brunt of the inevitable pursuit. However, an army of nearly 80,000 surviving men, dragging its wounded and its remaining baggage, cannot simply slip away unnoticed. The Roman column was a massive, lumbering target, stretching for miles along the mountain passes, and King Phraates IV had absolutely no intention of letting it escape his territory intact. The Parthian strategy shifted seamlessly from passive starvation to active, relentless harassment. Utilizing the elevated ridges and broken ground that flanked the Roman route, the Parthian cavalry initiated a rolling, continuous ambush. They strictly maintained their doctrine of avoiding any close-quarters melee, knowing that in a direct clash of heavy infantry, the Roman short sword would still prevail. Instead, swarms of highly mobile horse archers would crest a hill, loose devastating volleys of arrows into the dense Roman ranks, and then immediately wheel their mounts away before the legions could launch a countercharge. The Parthian composite bow was a highly effective weapon, capable of penetrating standard mail armor at close range, making every volley a lethal threat. The psychological toll of this tactic was immense. Veteran heavy infantrymen, trained to aggressively close the distance and crush their enemies, were forced to absorb a daily deafening barrage of missile fire from an enemy they could not physically reach. To survive this unbroken gauntlet, the Roman army fell back on the single greatest asset it possessed: structural discipline. Whenever the Parthian cavalry massed for an attack, the Roman trumpets would sound, and the marching column would instantly contract into the famous Testudo or tortoise formation. This was a marvel of battlefield engineering applied to human bodies. On command, the front ranks would halt and lock their massive curved wooden shields tightly together, creating a solid wall. The ranks behind them would lift their shields overhead, overlapping the edges like the interlocking tiles of a roof, while the men on the outermost files faced outward to protect the exposed flanks. The result was a moving, heavily armored bunker of wood, bronze, and iron that effectively neutralized the penetrative power of the incoming arrows. While the Testudo saved thousands of lives, its mechanical reality on a 300-mile march was brutally exhausting. The formation was inherently defensive and nearly static. Maintaining the tightly interlocked shield roof while moving forward was incredibly difficult, forcing the men to adopt a slow, crouched shuffle under the heavy weight of their equipment. The undulating terrain of the highland passes further complicated the maneuver. As the Roman soldiers stepped over loose rocks, traversed steep inclines, or navigated sudden dips in the ground, the perfect geometry of the shield roof would inevitably fracture. Parthian archers, observing from higher elevations, were highly trained to wait for these exact moments of structural failure, driving their arrows into any momentary gap that appeared in the armored shell. Consequently, the retreat became a paralyzing sequence of starting and stopping. Every Parthian assault forced the column to halt, form the tortoise, weather the barrage of arrows, and wait for the enemy to withdraw before slowly resuming the march. This tactical friction bled the Roman momentum dry, turning what should have been a standard day's march into a grinding crawl. The legionaries were burning massive amounts of energy, holding heavy shields overhead for hours on end, severely compounding the starvation they were already enduring. Roman discipline and engineering had prevented an immediate slaughter, holding the fractured army together under a pressure that would have broken nearly any other fighting force in the ancient world. Yet, this tactical adaptation only solved one half of the survival equation. The true architect of the Roman collapse was not the Parthian composite bow, but the relentless, arid geography of the Highland Plateau. Deprived of reliable supply lines, the marching column was soon consumed by profound dehydration. King Phraates IV's scorched earth policy ensured that the few rivers and shallow wells along the retreat route were either deliberately fouled or naturally highly saline. Driven mad by thirst, legionaries broke their rigid formations to drink from stagnant toxic pools. The immediate result was an outbreak of widespread dysentery and violent gastrointestinal illness. This environmental strike effectively neutralized Roman defensive tactics. A soldier crippled by disease physically cannot maintain the strength to hold the heavy wooden shield required to form the tortoise, instantly creating fatal gaps in the armored roof and exposing the entire unit to the lingering Parthian archers. As the final grain reserves evaporated, starvation compounded the lethal effects of the poisoned water. Men who had been reduced to slaughtering and eating their own dying draft animals eventually turned to foraging whatever scattered flora survived in the barren terrain. In their absolute desperation for calories, thousands of soldiers consumed an unidentified local root. Ancient historical sources record that this specific plant acted as a potent, fatal neurotoxin. The afflicted men lost their memories, plunging into a state of severe delirium where they obsessively moved heavy rocks and clawed at the dirt with their bare hands until they collapsed from exhaustion and died. The command structure watched helplessly as their veteran heavy infantry, men who had survived the brutal civil wars of the Republic, were systematically erased, not by enemy weapons, but by an unfamiliar, hostile ecosystem. The environment eventually achieved what the massive Parthian cavalry could not. It broke the legendary discipline of the legions. During one particularly chaotic night march, a sudden blind panic gripped the exhausted and starving ranks. Believing they were under a massive night attack, or simply pushed entirely beyond the limits of human psychological endurance, Roman soldiers turned their aggression inward. A violent mutiny erupted as desperate legionaries ransacked their own remaining baggage train. They slaughtered their comrades and loyal guards to loot the few remaining rations, ultimately plundering Mark Antony's personal treasury wagons in the dark. The supreme commander effectively lost all tactical control of his army, forced to watch as the core foundation of Roman military power, its absolute internal order and strict hierarchy, dissolved into a violently fractured, leaderless mob. For Mark Antony, this horrific internal collapse marked the absolute nadir of his military career. The specter of Marcus Licinius Crassus, whose severed head and hands had been paraded before the Parthian royal court 17 years earlier, loomed heavily over the triumvir. Convinced that the expedition was now entirely lost and that he would inevitably be captured alive to be publicly humiliated in the same gruesome manner, Antony summoned his most trusted personal bodyguard. In a grim testament to the utter desperation of the Roman position, the supreme commander issued a standing execution order. If capture became imminent, the bodyguard was to immediately run him through with a sword and sever his head, ensuring the Parthians could not identify his body or claim him as a living trophy. Yet driven by the raw, deeply ingrained instinct to survive, the fractured remnants of the army managed to regroup at dawn, continuing to stagger relentlessly northward through the punishing mountain passes. Discipline was slowly, brutally restored by the surviving centurions only when the topography began to subtly shift, signaling the approaching border of the Armenian highlands. After weeks of enduring relentless attrition, starvation, and toxic flora, the terrain finally offered a tangible reprieve. The final Parthian assault broke against the Roman rearguard just as the vanguard plunged into the fast-moving currents of the Araxes River. King Phraates IV knew this was the last geographical barrier before the Roman column escaped into the safety of the Armenian highlands, and he committed his heavy cataphracts to shatter the retreating lines. Forced to defend a chaotic river crossing, the surviving Roman legionaries locked their shields one final time, absorbing the sheer kinetic impact of the lances to buy time for the wounded and the baggage to cross. The icy shock of the Araxes water was the only relief the exhausted heavy infantry felt as they waded through the treacherous current, maintaining a fighting retreat until the last cohort scrambled onto the northern bank. The Parthian cavalry, unwilling to pursue the Romans out of their own advantageous territory, halted their advance at the water's edge, abruptly ending the military phase of the catastrophe. Stepping onto friendly soil did not bring a triumphant end to the campaign, but rather the grim arithmetic of survival. As the Supreme Commander ordered a formal census of the remaining units, the true scale of the disaster materialized. Mark Antony had lost approximately 20,000 veteran infantry and 4,000 cavalry directly to the combat and starvation of the retreat. Furthermore, the severe malnutrition, dysentery, and exposure suffered during the march continued to harvest lives even within the safety of the Armenian borders, claiming thousands more in the days that followed. In total, the expedition cost the Roman Republic over 30,000 dead. This staggering casualty count rivaled the infamous slaughter at Carrhae, representing nearly a third of Antony's entire invasion force, entirely wiped off the strategic map without a single major pitched battle ever taking place. It was a complete operational failure of Western heavy infantry operating in an Eastern theater, dismantled entirely by terrain, superior mobility, and continuous logistical harassment. The immediate survival of the battered legions now depended entirely on the very man who had guaranteed their ruin. King Artavasdes II of Armenia, whose sudden defection and withdrawal of his native cavalry had permanently exposed the Roman siege train to destruction, now controlled the only viable food supply in the region. The Roman officers and the surviving rank and file demanded immediate, violent retribution for what they viewed as high treason against the Republic. However, Mark Antony was forced into a deeply humiliating display of political pragmatism. Understanding that his starving, fractured army was in no condition to initiate a punitive war against a fortified ally, the Supreme Commander swallowed his fury. He maintained strict diplomatic protocol, greeting the Armenian monarch as a friend and ally purely to secure the vital grain shipments required to keep his remaining soldiers alive. This forced capitulation perfectly encapsulated the ruined state of Antony's grand ambition. He had marched out of the eastern provinces at the head of a monumental war machine, intending to eclipse Julius Caesar's military legacy and return to the Senate as the undisputed master of the global power structure. Instead, he led a broken, starved remnant back into friendly territory, having lost irreplaceable veteran legions and his crucial aura of invincibility. The reports of the disaster did not take long to cross the Mediterranean, and Octavian weaponized the casualty lists with ruthless political efficiency. As the names of the 30,000 dead and the loss of Statianus' siege train were read aloud in the Roman Senate, Octavian launched a systematic propaganda campaign to dismantle his rival's reputation. He did not frame the defeat as a tragedy of harsh terrain or an unavoidable military setback. Instead, he presented it as the ultimate proof of Mark Antony's incompetence. Octavian argued that the supreme commander had abandoned the disciplined, methodical virtues of Roman warfare, corrupted entirely by Eastern decadence. The catastrophic logistical failure in Media Atropatene instantly drained the immense political capital Antony had traveled eastward to secure. He had marched out to conquer Parthia and become the undisputed master of the Republic. He returned as a vulnerable, humiliated target. Desperate to rebuild his shattered military and project strength on the eastern frontier, Antony was forced into absolute financial dependence on the Ptolemaic kingdom. He required the vast wealth of Cleopatra's treasury simply to rearm, recruit, and stabilize his surviving legions. However, this total reliance handed Octavian the exact narrative he needed to consolidate power in Italy. The younger triumvir successfully convinced the Roman public that Antony was no longer acting as a loyal commander of the Republic, but had instead become a subservient thrall to a foreign queen. The balance of global power had fundamentally shifted in the barren mountains of Parthia. The strategic ruin of 36 BCE set the two factions on an inescapable collision course, leading directly to the final war of the Roman Republic and Antony's ultimate destruction at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE. The Parthian campaign of Mark Antony remains one of the most profound logistical catastrophes in ancient military history. It stands as a grim, enduring testament to the reality that overwhelming numerical superiority cannot conquer geography. A colossal force of 100,000 men, backed by elite heavy infantry and massive engineering assets, was systematically dismantled without a single decisive pitched battle ever taking place. The expedition was destroyed by a single impatient command decision that divided the army, exposing the vulnerable supply lines to an enemy that understood attrition better than direct confrontation. Subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together, and join us for the next chapter of World Chronicles.